Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to an edition of Hashtag Finance. I'm your host, Barrington Miller from the Canadian Securities Exchange, and we are live and direct, remote, working from home, yet we're still bringing you really, really good content and featuring our issuers. And without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Christopher J. Morrow, CEO of Algernon. Thank you for coming to the show.
You're very welcome. Thank you for the interview.
So let's jump right into it. You have been a little busy lately. Your company has been, dare I say, hot and in the news and headline grabbing, all for the right reasons. What is it? Let's just jump into it. What is going on at Algernon?
Well, so for viewers that are new to our story, Algernon is a drug repurposing company. We're clinical stage, so a pharmaceutical development company. What's unique about our business model is that we are not advancing new chemical entities. Our business model is based on investigating drugs that are already approved, so they're generic drugs, but they've been exposed to a small regional market, and that's because of the issue of generic competition. So we investigate these drugs that are older, they have a known safety history, and our chief science officer developed a process where he could look at an old drug, understand its target, its mechanism of action, and then developed a theory that that drug might be able to treat another disease. Most of us don't think about this as lay people getting medication from our physician and going to the drugstore and going home. Most drugs have what's known as a polypharma effect. The drug's not just treating one or behaving in a certain way in our body, it's actually, there's a cascade of things going on. We tend to think of them as perhaps side effects, might cause skin rash or dizziness or a migraine headache. But believe it or not, that drug might also be reducing a tumor that you might have, or it might be treating a condition that you didn't know you had, and it's having that effect. So that needs to be understood scientifically. We study these drugs, and then we try to advance them to a regulatory approval. What's happened in the last 7 weeks is that our lead drug, which is a Japanese drug called ifenprodil, which is used to treat dizziness and vertigo and is approved in Japan and South Korea. We came across, we've been investigating it for a different lung disease called idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. This is a scarring, it's a disease of the lung where the lungs become fibrotic, scarred. Breathing is very difficult. You only have a median lifespan of about 3 years from diagnosis. And we were investigating ifenprodil. We found out that it has anti-fibrotic capabilities. But 7 weeks ago, my chief science officer discovered that in an independent study, it was also highly effective in treating animals infected with H5N1, which is a very lethal form of flu. And in fact, it has a 50% lethality. And you just think about how the world's turned upside down with COVID, which has a 3% mortality rate.
Right.
Luckily for us, it's not contagious, but the drug ifenprodil they were investigating showed some tremendous results in an animal study. It improved survivability, reduced acute lung injury and inflammation. And so we've made the connection. If we could see that in an animal study for H5N1, we may see similar results in a human study for COVID-19.
Now, I'm going to jump a little bit all over the place. I mean, for the layperson, I know the story about, I think it was Viagra, how it was developed for something else, and we all know that, and so so we can draw parallels, at least with the process with your drug.
Sorry to interrupt, but that's actually called repositioning. That's taking a drug that had not been approved and finding and directing it to a new.
Oh, okay.
Okay, wow. So that I think it was in a phase 2 study. The mice, it was a human study. People were reporting perhaps amorous interest, and they said, wow, this is a vasodilator. It's improving blood supply. and it got shifted. That's repositioning. That's taking a drug that's never been
Okay.
approved, finding a new use. We focus on drugs that are approved. They've been through at least in a major regulatory body, and now finding out if we can repurpose it, reuse it now for a new drug. A new disease.
Now, when you're doing these tests and trials, are you doing them in North America, in Asia? Are they all over the world? Does it matter?
Well, we start with animal trials, and really it doesn't matter. And basically, you want to run a well-run animal study. So you find out where the best animal research labs are.
Okay.
And the average person may not know this, but research scientists can give a mouse any disease you need to study. If you're studying tuberculosis, brain cancer, the mouse gets infected. The mechanism is similar to what the disease would look like in man. Then you can treat that animal with your compound, and then you can look at the results. So all of our trials initially were animal studies. They were well run in that for comparator arms, we used the world's leading treatments for the different diseases we've been studying. And we've been investigating not only lung disease, but also bowel disease, liver, and kidney. And so if we were testing one of our drugs, the goal, the target, is to try to find a drug that's better than the current drug treating mankind. And so you would run what's known as a comparator arm. Some of the mice would be infected and treated with your drug. Some of the mice would be infected and then treated with the current standard of care. At the end of the study, you look at the data. It's always data driven. Which drug did better? And if one of our drugs that we're investigating outperformed the standard of care, that's now a motivation to advance it into human trials.
What's the typical time frame, or does it vary as far as?
It can. It depends on the animal study and the condition. Are you looking at a chronic condition? Let's say kidney disease.
Right.
In which case your animal model may be a number of weeks. It is possible to do month-long, obviously, animal studies. It depends on the species you're working in. So it ranges weeks to months. It just depends on the disease, and it depends on the model that was developed. Sometimes they can recreate a disease. An example, we studied a disease of the liver called non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, NASH.
Okay.
And there's a well-known model from a Japanese contract research group where they can recreate liver disease in the animal, but it progresses over 2 weeks. So that type of progression, you can see very quick results from that study. But so it just depends on the disease and the model and the study objectives and other details.
So where are we today? Where is Algernon today? I was reading recently about the phase 2B, and you received, and obviously you're going to correct me if I'm wrong, but
sure.
I think you've received FDA approval that if it works to go to phase 3 without reapplying.
So just for clarity, so we haven't received approval yet, except in South Korea, but just to connect the dots for you. So okay. I'm going to back it up a bit. Our lead drug is called ifentrotil. It's this Japanese drug we've been investigating, developed by Sanofi originally. We've been investigating it for idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, and it outperformed the current standard of care. These were drugs by Roche and Boehringer Ingelheim in our animal study, reduced fibrosis to a greater extent than those compounds, and we had been planning on a phase 2 human trial for IPF and chronic cough when this data came out about H5N1, where the Chinese scientists confirmed that ifentrotil improved mortality in their animal study for H5N1 by 40%, reduced acute lung injury and inflammation. So we immediately, this was 7 weeks ago, began to develop a clinical research program to test ifentrotil for COVID-19. And we began an application process, and it's different in different jurisdictions. Primarily, we've been working in South Korea, where the drug is currently approved and available, Australia, Canada, and the US. Mm-hmm. The drug was recently approved. Well, today we announced approval to proceed to a phase 2 study in South Korea. It's an investigator-led study. We're advancing quickly in Australia. We have filed what's known as a pre-IND application with the US FDA, where you have It's an informal, formal process with the FDA where you share your plans with them for your trial, and they come back to you and give you their comments. Are you, should you go back and start at square one? Are you going down the right path? We had positive feedback from the US FDA. It encouraged us now to move forward with an application for a trial, which we're working on. We've
Okay.
also communicated with Health Canada in what would be considered an initial meeting. But yesterday we applied for what's known as a CTA, a clinical trial application with Health Canada for a rather unique study design called a phase 2B/3. So there are three phases to drug development.
Yes.
Phase one, dosing. Phase two, treating your patient group that you're trying to, that you've developed your drug for. Phase three is a bigger phase two. With a phase 2/3 study, what your, if you hit your endpoints, in other words, you have interim data that's positive, you start as a phase two, but midstream, you can move your trial to a phase three. You still have to go through a regulatory process, but it's much faster than running a phase two, stopping it, looking at your data, applying for a phase three study, starting from the beginning. We've applied using World Health Organization guidelines for a COVID-19 study. We projected 100 patients to begin. At some point during the initial phase, I think the study period is 3 to 4 weeks. We can look at interim data. If the data is positive, we go back to Health Canada and we request to now advance it up into a phase three. And what's interesting about that is if you have positive phase three data, the next step is market approval. There are other steps to go through, but your human testing process would be complete. So that's what's unique about the trial study we've submitted to Health Canada yesterday.
Are there any other competitors in the space, or any competitors that are moving along like you are? Because
yeah, so at a high level, there's sort of three areas. You have antivirals. The antiviral is a very specific pathogen targeted treatment. And typically that drug is somehow stopping the pathogen or the virus from replicating.
Okay.
That's an antiviral. There are a number of companies advancing antivirals. Either there may even be repurposed antivirals. Hydrochloroquine would be an example. And some others that maybe the folks watching might be familiar with. Then you have vaccines. A vaccine is also highly targeted. They take the pathogen, they deactivate it, and they present it into the host. So they inject you with the vaccine that's sort of been declawed. Causes a bit of an issue with some folks, but it's not the full-blown result of the disease. Your body builds up an immunity. And now when you are exposed to the actual pathogen, you're way ahead of the game. Keep in mind that coronavirus pathogens are known to change and to evolve. And so you have different strains that will present. Now, based on the data, and I haven't seen anything to show it behaving differently, I haven't seen new strains identified, but they're looking at it. But when you have an antiviral or a vaccine, those are target specific, and if the vaccine morphs and changes, if the pathogen evolves, and that's really what it's called, it's an evolution of sorts, and to try to evade your immune response, then they have to be redeveloped again and targeted now for the adjusted pathogen. In our case, we're really a drug treatment. That's the area that we're working in. I think there are a number of other companies. We believe, based on the animal data, that our drug would be considered cytoprotective, or protecting the tissue in the lung. I mean, think about, again, H5N1, 50% plus lethality. COVID has shut the world down and it's only 3%. And in the animal study, ifenprotal improves survivability by 40%. So it's active in the lung. Will it be active with COVID-19? We hope. That would mean it's protecting the lung tissue. It also shows a reduction in acute lung injury and inflammation. There's something called the cytokine storm, which is the immune system's response to the infection, which sort of focuses in the lung, destroying not only the virus, but also healthy tissue. And then if folks survive that, they also end up with fibrotic or scarred lung tissue. There is evidence, animal data, suggesting our drug may also prevent that process. So bottom line, we believe that ifenprotal may reduce the severity and duration of a COVID-19 attack, and that's what we are anxious to begin testing in human clinical trials. Clinical trial means humans, and that's what we've been working on.
Best case scenario, because your company and your drug is offering a huge ray of light and hope. Best case scenario, what's the earliest it could be out there? It could be in the market.
Well, we
like absolute wish.
Yeah.
Rub the lamp, get the genie out.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're talking about 90 days from the start of a trial. Take our South Korea. Let's take that one because it's actually been approved. 40 patients.
Yeah.
The good news in South Korea is that their curve has flattened. There's been some evidence lately of the virus being dormant and sort of reactivating, but it's an issue of patient enrollment. So if the trial can be fully enrolled quickly, we're probably looking at 90 days. It's a 4-week treatment period and may take a week or 2 or 3 to enroll all of the patients. Just depends on where the trial is. And then you look at the data. So we're talking 90 days. And now next step would be, is the data powerful enough? So what's the statistical significance? How well powered do we then need to go into a phase 3? Can we make a case to the regulators that in fact the data is so strong, we may not need a phase 3? So I think we're talking months, and we are also, and this is of importance to the folks that are watching, we are also reformulating the drug into an IV formulation. And we've already begun manufacturing what's known as synthesis of the active pharmaceutical ingredient, the API.
Yep.
And we're developing an IV formulation because people that have this severe pneumonia and infection may not be able to take an oral dose and the capacity to digest a pill, even to swallow it. So an IV formulation is key. That is perfect for a hospital or ICU setting. And that will take a few months as well. So we're talking months here, but I think because of the way we're running our trial, we're dealing with people who have moderate to severe disease. And I think the good news would be if our drug is working, that we don't have to produce drug for the entire world. We're talking about people who are presenting with moderate or severe disease.
Right.
And reducing their severity and duration. And so that's a different model, but to answer your question best I can, I think we'd be talking months. We're not talking years.
Now, is there a possibility, and does this happen often, of your drug being approved and being able to go to market in one jurisdiction but not another? So could it be on the shelves in South Korea, but because of nuances with the FDA or Health Canada?
It can happen. I mean, the granddaddy of all market approvals is the US FDA.
Okay.
And so really, when people talk about the FDA, they need to keep in mind that every country has a Food and Drug Administration. But
yes.
We say FDA, we think US because we're North American centric here. But typically, if you get a drug approved with the US FDA, that's such a high standard that many other countries accept the US FDA approval. Europe, different. It's just really on a country by country basis. The same would not be reversed if you had a drug approved in South Korea. Could you move it in? There are into the US. There are some Japanese examples where a Japanese drug that might get approval in Japan would also be accepted by the US. There are conventions and agreements. They can share information about the drug, its purity profile, the toxicity profile, any adverse safety reactions, what's known as SAEs, adverse side effects. So this is a process. Every country has its own, but you would try to start with the US FDA and then filter down. And sometimes it's a matter of filing that data in different jurisdictions. You may not be asked to repeat it, but it's on a case-by-case basis.
Now, Let's examine the downside a little bit. Side effects, um, anything of note, anything that you can talk about.
Yeah, no, I can talk about it all because this drug has been around since the early 1970s. So when we investigate a drug, we develop what's known as a investigational brochure. It's the
Okay.
complete background or a pedigree of sorts on the drug. And what you're looking at is the known side effects. And from what we can see, from what's been made public, and to the best of our ability, in terms of getting that data. And by the way, we seem to have to a certain extent, we've obviously satisfied South Korea. It's approved there.
Yes.
We've had initial meetings with the US FDA and Health Canada. We had positive feedback. So there isn't a concern. I mean, there are side effects with every drug. These are what we would consider not serious: headache, maybe some gastrointestinal upset. Um, there's been some report of dizziness, although it's being prescribed for dizziness. This is an NMDA receptor, and for those of you who are like to dig into the science, it's similar to a number of other drugs that are hitting receptors in the brain that can actually cause that sort of an effect. And but there's been nothing serious reported. Plus, this drug has been investigated in what's known as off-label studies, where other investigators have looked at the drug and said, I wonder, maybe this drug will treat another condition. The most recent and largest was 1,000 patients. They are hypersensitive in a study to look at side effects. And again, no serious side effects reported. We believe, based on that and its history, that it's a very, very safe drug. And just to comment, safety is within the context of the drug. As an example,
For sure.
You have some very toxic chemotherapy drugs that are safe in the context of taken within the parameters. Maybe you can only take one type of a chemo drug for 2 or 3 weeks, because any more and it'll damage the kidneys or liver. Is it safe? Of course, it's safe. It's approved, but it's within the treatment guidelines and what's approved. But in this case, it has wide-ranging safety.
No, that's a very, very important distinction, and I hope our listeners and our audience take note of that. Let's shift gears a little bit. Algernon, where did you come up with that? Where is it from?
Algernon is from the name of a science fiction novel, a short story called Flowers for Algernon. And the novel was about an experiment that could make you smarter, and it was conducted on a mouse, and the mouse's name was Algernon. And the caretaker of the lab wanted to try the treatment as well, and he did, and he became much smarter, and he lost his friends and so on. At one point in the novel, he brings flowers to the grave of the mouse, Algernon, and there's your title, Flowers for Algernon.
Oh, so wow. I love stuff like that.
I liked the name when I knew the novel. It was faint in my memory, but my colleague and Chief Science Officer, Dr. Mark Williams, he had been thinking about that for a while. Now, we've been investigating a number of drugs, and I had to convince him to call the company Algernon. And we sort of chuckle that it's interesting that, because we didn't know at the time, but our lead drug is a drug that's treating neurological conditions.
Wow.
And now poised, we hope, to be effective as a treatment for COVID. So some folks have trouble pronouncing the name. I noticed on YouTube last week somebody put up a little how to pronounce certain names, and it's how to pronounce Algernon. So some call it Algernon, and it's all good, but Algernon is the correct pronunciation, and that's the background.
Well, you've given me my next reading, the next book for my reading. So with your company, do you only work on one drug at a time? Do you have a few in the stable? What's the approach?
Great question. We actually started investigating 11 compounds. Some had been developed by the Soviet Union, so there's quite a story there. 1 or 2 from Japan, South Korea, In fact, ifenprotol also had its early roots in France. It was approved there for to help increase circulation initially. So there's a vasodilation effect of the drug. But in this, with our program, we started with 11. We sort of refined it down to 4 drugs that have been outperforming clinical standard of care.
Okay.
But due to, at least as of 2 months ago, we had limited resources, and we decided we would just advance ifenprotol for idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. And by the way, chronic cough. And I just would like to take a second to talk about chronic cough, which most folks may not realize is a really big problem, because it's cough that's persistent past 8 weeks with no real known cause. And right now, people are sort of being treated with over-the-counter lozenges and cough syrup and so on. But again, my colleague, Mark Williams, we saw such an effect with idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, and understanding a unique mechanism of action, he thought the drug might be effective treating chronic cough. So we ran an animal study for acute cough, and we went up against Merck's phase 3 drug, gefapixant, which actually just reported some positive phase 3 data. And we outperformed Merck's drug by reducing the cough count and the onset for cough. So we've sort of got a number of things going with ifenprotol, IPF, chronic cough, and now we're investigating COVID. But that was just based on resources. Things have dramatically changed for the company. Our market cap
for
has
sure.
dramatically increased. And I think that provided that continues, we'll have the resources to be able to advance other drugs that we're repurposing. But so it's typically just access to capital, and access to capital will increase our velocity to continue on with clinical programs for the drugs that we've been investigating.
Well, let's talk a little business, because that's what we do at the Canadian Securities Exchange.
Sure.
I'm sure there are a few companies, a few big pharma companies that are kicking Algernon's tires, that are sort of seeing, hey, maybe this might be an acquisition target.
Well,
I'm sure, like, you don't have to say, but this is
as you know, public companies, other than these sorts of exchanges where we can talk about, the best rule of thumb is to talk about what we've announced, as opposed to but bottom line, the drug repurposing model is a unique model. It's not the most comfortable for big pharma, and I think typically based on my research and our collective experience, Mark and I think with positive phase 2 data, we'll maybe be on more radar screens. Big pharma, I mean, sometimes we make companies bigger than life. You know, billion-dollar companies still run by people just like you and I.
Right.
And actually, typically, somebody in that company has to carry the ball. They're the torch bearer. And so sometimes they're very risk adverse because you're layered in, and you know, there's emotional elements, psychological. People don't want to make mistakes, so sometimes they can actually approach new opportunities with a great deal of caution. Then you've got other examples where some companies, they're innovation units, and that's why they actually developed a unit of discovery or entrepreneurship within the company to sort of break through and say, look, take some risks. Don't look at this like we're a $4 billion company. Think about it as innovators. And those departments can often step forward. But in terms of our process, we have a business model. We're executing it. I would never sit around as a CEO and wait for someone to reach out. I can say we're not really focused on outreach right now. We have our milestones in play. We're conducting phase 2 trials. Phase 2 data is a very important moment of inflection for a small company like Algernon. And what's interesting with the COVID studies, typically a phase 2 could take a year and a half. People are waiting for the data. Because this is an acute condition, treatment is 3 to 4 weeks. We'll have data very quickly. So everything is going at warp speed. But as an investor, phase 2 trials are typically 50-50. 50% historically of phase 2 trials succeed. So there are investors, bio-investors, smarter ones than I, who look at a stock and they say, I'm investing because it's in a phase 2. And
Right.
50-50 that the drug will show positive data. And then the value creation is enormous. Now, one important sophistication or nuance with Algernon. Let's go back to phase 2 trials. 50% succeed, 50% fail. Of the failure, 30% due to safety. So despite 5 or 6 years of
Really?
preclinical work where the drug never leaves the lab, a phase 1 study on for dosing and safety, you're still getting significant failure in phase 2 due to safety, and phase 3. Now I'm asked, why does that happen? Well, it's the
Yeah.
first time you're treating your patient population, and typically for a longer period of time. And so drugs are approved for 2 reasons, safety and efficacy. And my point is that if you take a drug with a known safety history, you're actually increasing your chances of a phase 2 success, because it's unlikely to fail due to safety reasons. So instead of 50-50, you're talking about an improved odds ratio that your drug will have efficacy if you can get it into a phase 2. So that's an interesting something to think about for those that like statistics.
Well, Chris, I really, really appreciate you taking the time to not only educate us about what you're doing, but also, you know, give a little science talk and science lessons to the viewers, to the investors, to the friends and followers of the Canadian Securities Exchange. And on behalf of just ordinary citizens, we just want to say thank you for the work that you and the good people at your company are doing. And we wish you nothing but continued success, and not only with this, but going forward.
Thank
And
you. Thank you so much.
this has been a very, very scientific episode of Hashtag Finance. I'm your host, Barrington Miller. I'm here with Chris Morrow of Algernon Pharmaceuticals. Thank you very much.
Thank you.